March 1945. The Third Army was tearing through the German heartland. The resistance was crumbling, but the devastation left behind was absolute. Roads were choked with refugees, retreating forces, and the endless mechanized column of American armor pushing east. Amidst the mud, the blood, and the freezing rain, the logistics of keeping an army moving and its wounded treated were a waking nightmare. Medical supplies were sacred. Convoys marked with the stark red cross on a white background were given absolute priority on the shattered roads. They meant life. They meant salvation for men bleeding out in the snow. They were the one universal symbol of mercy in a landscape devoid of it. On a bleak Thursday afternoon, elements of the Third Army intercepted a peculiar convoy near the Bavarian border. 4 heavily guarded Opel Blitz trucks, their canvas covers pulled tight, painted with pristine, oversized Red Cross emblems. By the rules of war, they should have been carrying bandages, morphine, surgical kits, and wounded men. But the American infantrymen who stopped them noticed something immediately wrong. The trucks were riding entirely too low on their axles. Medical supplies are bulky, but they are relatively light. These trucks groaned under a massive dead weight. Furthermore, the German drivers were not medics. They were hardened SS regulars, their uniforms stripped of unit insignias, and they were sweating profusely despite the biting cold. When the American lieutenant in charge ordered the canvas pulled back, expecting to find stretchers and bleeding soldiers, the freezing air grew incredibly still. There were no stretchers, there were no medics, there was no morphine. Instead, the trucks were packed floor to ceiling with heavy, reinforced wooden crates. Stamped with the eagle and swastika, the manifests nailed to the wood did not list any medical terminology. When the soldiers pried the first crate open with a crowbar, the sound of splintering wood echoed sharply in the quiet valley. Inside, packed meticulously in straw and velvet, were Renaissance paintings, gold chalices, and centuries-old tapestries stripped from the museums and cathedrals of conquered Europe. The American men stood in complete silence, staring at the priceless looted art. Then they looked back at the massive Red Cross symbols painted on the canvas. The implications were sickening. Somewhere, field hospitals were running out of life-saving supplies. Somewhere, men were dying because transport was scarce. But a high-ranking German commander had prioritized his stolen, personal treasure, hiding his greed behind the universal symbol of medical mercy. The lieutenant didn't shout. He didn't curse. The betrayal of the emblem was too profound for ordinary anger. He simply walked to his jeep, picked up the radio, and bypassed the usual logistical channels entirely. The report traveled fast. It landed on the field desk of General George S. Patton just before sunset. The report didn't just sit on Patton's desk. It vibrated with the urgency of a frontline crisis. Patton was not a man who suffered fools, and he was certainly not a man who suffered thieves. The report stated that the German convoy had been tracked to a temporary holding facility for high-ranking prisoners of war, a chateau requisitioned for the purpose of holding generals before they were shipped further west to camps in France or the UK. Patton didn't call for a staff meeting. He didn't ask his G2 intelligence officer for a deeper study. He didn't check with the legal department about the jurisdictional complexities of investigating a prisoner of war for criminal activity committed outside the scope of his capture. He knew one thing. A German general, an officer of the Wehrmacht, had abused the most sacred symbol of war, the Red Cross, to hide his own petty, filthy greed. He was in his jeep before the sun was fully down, the engine idling with that familiar, aggressive growl. His aide, realizing the mood of the general, didn't bother asking where they were going. He simply grabbed the folder, checked his sidearm, and scrambled into the passenger seat. "That chateau," Patton growled, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that could silence a room of hardened veterans. "The one holding the German brass. We're going there." The drive was silent. Patton's face was a mask of cold, controlled fury. He wasn't thinking about the tactical implications of this move. He wasn't thinking about the Geneva Convention protocols or the diplomatic headache this might cause the Allies. He was thinking about the empty beds in the field hospitals. He was thinking about the nurses who had to wash bandages because the supply lines were clogged with bureaucratic nonsense. Or, as he now understood, the vanity of a German general playing museum curator while soldiers were dying in the dirt. The chateau loomed out of the dark, a sprawling, opulent structure that stood in jarring contrast to the ruin of the surrounding countryside. American MPs stood guard at the gate. As Patton's jeep barreled through the entrance, kicking up gravel, the guards scrambled to attention, startled by the sight of the three-star general himself arriving in the dead of night. Patton stepped out. He didn't wait for the MPs to approach. He marched straight to the heavy oak doors of the chateau. He wasn't here to negotiate. He wasn't here to facilitate a transfer. He was here to conduct a very personal, very violent audit of a German general's character. He could feel the weight of the situation in his gut. This wasn't about the war effort anymore. It was about the fundamental nature of the man he was about to face. My beloved child, draw even closer to me now, and let the supernatural weight of my peace completely submerge your racing thoughts this very second. Do not allow your mind to drift back to the endless list of worries or the heavy fog of uncertainty that has been clouding your vision. I am reaching directly into the deepest, most exhausted chambers of your mind to permanently break the spirit of overthinking, mental torment, and chronic anxiety that the enemy has used to paralyze your steps. I know the silent agony of the mental battlefields you fight every single day. I see you when the world goes quiet and you are left alone with a barrage of intrusive thoughts, playing out worst-case scenarios, replaying past hurts, and drowning in a suffocating sea of what-ifs. The enemy has tried to clutter your mind with a thick fog of confusion to ensure that you cannot see the brilliant doors of destiny I have swung wide open right in front of you. He wants your mind to be so utterly consumed by the chaos of your current circumstances that you lose sight of my unchanging promises. You have felt mentally paralyzed, emotionally drained, and spiritually fatigued, wondering if you will ever experience true mental clarity and quiet rest again. But hear my authoritative decree over your mind today. I am the Prince of Peace, and I am commanding the violent storm within your thoughts to be absolutely still. The mental clarity, the sharp focus, and the divine vision that the thief tried to violently suffocate are being fully restored to you with heavenly interest. I am uprooting every seed of doubt, confusion, and fear that the enemy planted in your mind during your darkest seasons of isolation. Where there was a chaotic storm of overthinking, I am releasing a supernatural tranquility that surpasses all human understanding. I am renewing your perspective and giving you eyes of faith to see your future exactly as I have written it in the books of heaven, full of hope, victory, and unprecedented abundance. You will no longer live as a prisoner to your thoughts. Your mind is now fully guarded by my grace. The heavy cloud of mental exhaustion is lifting off your head right now, replaced by fresh, divine inspiration and crisp clarity. Type, Jesus, quiet my mind right now to lock this divine peace into your daily reality. Do not let your gaze wander, my child, for the next layer of your total restoration will shatter the spirit of stagnation and propel you forward. Patton stepped into the room. It was not a military office. It was a sanctuary of stolen wealth. Heavy velvet curtains blocked out the reality of the war. Crystal decanters caught the low, flickering light of the fireplace. Sitting behind a massive mahogany desk was General von Klessen, a man who looked as though he had never spent a single day in the mud of the Eastern Front. He didn't rise. He didn't even acknowledge the 3 stars on Patton's collar with anything more than a bored, aristocratic glance. He held a glass of cognac in one hand, the crystal catching the firelight. "General Patton, I presume?" von Klessen said, his voice dripping with a calculated, weary disdain. "To what do I owe this intrusive visit? I am a prisoner of war, I believe the Geneva Convention has quite a bit to say about the treatment of senior officers." Patton didn't answer. He didn't even take off his leather gloves. He walked slowly across the room, his boots grinding grit and mud into the pristine, antique Persian rug, a rug that had likely been ripped from a parlor in Warsaw or Paris. He stopped at the desk, leaning forward until his face was mere inches from the Germans. The air in the room grew heavy, the silence stretching until it was almost physically painful. "I don't give a damn about your comfort, General," Patton said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that could silence a room of hardened veterans. "And I give even less of a damn about your conventions." He reached into the folder his aide had carried in and slammed the manifest of the medical convoy onto the desk, right next to the German's cognac glass. "My men found your trucks," Patton continued, his eyes locked onto the Germans. "They were painted with the Red Cross. My men were looking for morphine. They were looking for plasma. They were looking for any scrap of aid that could keep a dying boy from breathing his last in the back of a freezing ambulance." Von Klessen didn't blink. He took a slow, deliberate sip of his drink, his expression remaining perfectly, infuriatingly smooth. "A logistical error, I am sure. Transport is chaotic. One truck looks much like another in the fog of retreat." Patton let out a sharp, mirthless laugh. "Don't lie to me. It's an insult to my intelligence, and you aren't half as smart as you think you are. You didn't leave those trucks in the fog. You parked them behind your lines so you could smuggle your private collection of looted art across the border. You took the lifeblood out of our medical chain to save a few canvases painted by dead men." Patton straightened up, towering over the desk. He looked around the room, taking in the priceless tapestries and sculptures stacked in the corners like common clutter. "You think you're a man of culture," Patton whispered, the threat in his voice more dangerous than a shout. "But you're nothing but a thief, and while you were worrying about the provenance of a painting, my surgeons were working by the light of a single bulb, cutting into boys because they didn't have the drugs you were busy hoarding." Von Klessen finally stiffened. The mask of arrogance slipped just a fraction. He had expected a diplomatic reprimand. He had expected the rules of war to protect his dignity. He hadn't expected the visceral, bone-deep fury of a man who viewed soldiers as his own family. Patton reached out and grabbed the edge of the mahogany desk, his knuckles turning white through his gloves. The weight of his authority seemed to collapse the very oxygen in the room. "I am going to ask you one more time, Von Klessen. Where are the keys to the crates? And don't you dare speak to me of rights again, or I will ensure that the only room you see for the rest of your life is a solitary cell, and the only art you see is the gray concrete of your own walls." The German general's hand hovered over his glass, then slowly fell to his side. He looked at Patton, and for the first time he saw a predator who had no interest in the rules of the game. Von Klessen's hands trembled, just for a second. It was the tremor of a man who realized that the usual currencies of power, rank, decorum, the unspoken gentleman's agreement between officers, had no value here. He looked at Patton, really looked at him, and saw not a diplomat, but a man who smelled of diesel, cordite, and raw, unadulterated purpose. "You are making a grave error, General," Von Klessen spat, though the bite was gone from his tone. "There are protocols. When this war ends—" "The war is ending right now for you," Patton interrupted, stepping closer. The sound of his boots on the floorboards was like the firing of a pistol. "And when the historians write about what you did, they won't write about your tactical brilliance. They won't write about the battles you commanded. They will write that you were a looter, a common, pathetic thief who traded the lives of his own men for the price of a painting." Patton turned to his aide, who was standing like a statue by the door. "Get the MPs. Tell them to strip the lower level. I want every crate opened, every piece of art catalogued, and I want every single one of those Red Cross trucks confiscated for military use. By morning, they better be carrying plasma, not portraits." The aide snapped a salute and moved. The German general gasped, Finally rising from his chair, his composure shattered. "You cannot touch those. Those are cultural treasures of the Reich." Patton grabbed the man by the collar of his uniform, pulling him forward until their noses were touching. The raw aggression was palpable. "Cultural treasures? You want to talk about culture? The culture of a man who lets his own soldiers scream in agony because he's worried about a frame?" He shoved von Klessen back into his chair with enough force to make the wood creak. "You're going to sit there and watch while my men take back everything you stole. And then you're going to be processed. Not as an officer, not as a general, but as a war criminal who perverted the sanctity of the Red Cross for personal gain. If you utter another word about your rights, I'll see to it that you're placed in a cell so small you'll wish you were back in the mud of the front lines." Von Klessen slumped, the fight draining out of him as the realization of his fate settled in. Patton didn't wait for a reply. He spun on his heel and walked out, leaving the German general alone in the room filled with his stolen, lifeless treasures, now surrounded by the sounds of American boots echoing through the chateau as the confiscation began. The vanity had been stripped bare, and the punishment was just beginning. The courtyard of the chateau became a bizarre, makeshift gallery. By midnight, the American GIs had systematically unloaded the 4 Opel Blitz trucks. Under the harsh, artificial glare of floodlights rigged to the truck's batteries, the contents of the crates were spread out across the cobblestones. It was a staggering collection. Oil paintings with gold leaf frames, marble busts that had survived centuries, and delicate, intricate relics that belonged in the Louvre or the Uffizi, not crammed into the back of a military supply vehicle. Patton watched, his hands clasped firmly behind his back, his face a mask of iron. He didn't look at the art with appreciation. He looked at it like he was viewing evidence in a homicide case. Each painting was a body, and each crate was a coffin. Von Klessen was brought out, flanked by 2 military police officers who held his arms with none of the ceremony afforded to a general. He was forced to stand in the mud, his polished jackboots sinking into the muck of the very front he had been so eager to avoid. He stared at his treasures, his life's collection, his escape plan for the post-war world, scattered on the dirty ground. "You have quite the eye, General," Patton said, his voice quiet but carrying clearly in the crisp, cold air. "I see you didn't just loot the art. You looted the provenance. You knew exactly what to take, didn't you?" Von Klessen's eyes darted between the paintings and Patton. "These were preserved. They were safe here." "Safe?" Patton barked, the sound cracking like a whip against the stone walls. "They were hidden behind a red cross. They were safe while thousands of my boys were dying because they couldn't get a damn drop of blood plasma. You weren't preserving them, Von Klessen. You were holding them hostage." Patton motioned to his aide. "Start the tally. I want an inventory of every single item, and I want a full breakdown of the weight. I want to know exactly how much medicine, how much blood, and how many blankets we could have moved if these crates hadn't been taking up space." The soldiers worked with a grim, rhythmic efficiency. They were not art experts, but they understood the weight of what was happening. Every crate removed revealed the stark reality. These trucks hadn't been on the road to support the Wehrmacht. They had been on the road to secure von Klessen's retirement. The German general watched his legacy being handled by men who smelled of sweat and grease, men who looked at his treasures with nothing but contempt. His face went pale, a sickly gray in the floodlights. It wasn't the art that broke him, it was the realization that in the eyes of this American commander, he had ceased to be a general. He had been reduced to a common thief, stripped of his rank, his dignity, and finally, his spoils. Patton leaned against the fender of a truck, lit a cigarette, and watched the inventory grow. He knew that by the time the sun came up, these trucks would be reloaded, not with the art of dead masters, but with the supplies that would save the living. And von Klessen would be on his way to a holding camp, not as an officer, but as a man whose soul had been weighed and found wanting. The morning after the raid on the chateau, the Third Army supply lines were humming with a renewed, almost frantic efficiency. The trucks that had been seized, those pristine, falsely marked vehicles, were now at the front of the queue, being loaded with crates of plasma, sulfa, and morphine. Patton stood at the edge of the staging area, watching the process. He didn't like to be seen as a micromanager, but this wasn't about logistics, it was about accountability. He watched a young corporal, barely out of his teens, carefully secure a crate of bandages into the back of a truck. The kid's hands were shaking, not from fear, but from an exhaustion so profound it looked like a physical weight. The war had a way of hollowing people out, of making them look like ghosts before they were even dead. Patton walked over, his heavy tread forcing the men to snap to attention, but he waved them down with a sharp motion. He stepped onto the flatbed of the truck and inspected the load himself. It was perfect. The medical supplies were packed tight, secured against the jarring ride of the front lines. He looked back at the corporal. "You have family back home, son?" Patton asked, his voice losing that sharp, dangerous edge it had held the night before. The corporal blinked, surprised by the question. "Yes, sir. A sister in Ohio. She's a nurse." Patton nodded. "Then you know that these crates aren't just wood and nails. They are the difference between your sister having a job to do and her having to write a letter to a mother who is waiting for a son who isn't coming home." The corporal straightened, his eyes sharpening. He understood. The entire atmosphere in the depot had shifted. The soldiers weren't just working for a paycheck or a victory parade anymore. They were working for the men in the mud. Patton jumped down from the truck. His aide was waiting with a report on the art collection. "General, the cataloging is nearly complete. We've counted over 200 pieces. Some of them are dated back to the 16th century. The curators we pulled from the ranks have already started the process of documenting them for transport back to secure storage." Patton took the clipboard. He didn't look at the list of titles. He didn't care about the brushwork or the gold leaf. He only cared about the number at the bottom. 4 trucks. 4 trucks that had been diverted to serve the vanity of a single man, while the spine of the Third Army was being broken in the field. "Get them moving," Patton said, handing the clipboard back. "I want these supplies at the forward hospitals by dusk, and I want the art moved to a secure location, well away from the front. If I find out that even a single postcard has gone missing, I'll hold the entire depot staff responsible. I want this cleared out. No traces of von Klessen's hobby left in my sector." He turned away, looking toward the horizon where the artillery flashes were painting the sky in jagged streaks of light. The war continued its relentless churn. But for this one moment, in the cold light of dawn, Patton felt a flicker of dark, grim justice. He had taken the thief's treasures and turned them into the lifeblood of his army. By the time the sun fully breached the horizon, the chateau was quiet again. The priceless art, once the centerpiece of von Klessen's vanity, was now merely recovered property, destined for a nondescript warehouse under heavy guard until the war's end. But the trucks, the 4 Opel Blitzes, were long gone. They had been rerouted, the Red Cross emblems washed clean of the dust, now speeding toward the forward aid stations that had been begging for supplies for weeks. The incident at the chateau did not remain a secret. In the army, silence is a commodity that is rarely traded for long. By the next morning, the story had rippled through the Third Army like wildfire. It wasn't told in official dispatches or whispered in the mess halls. It was shared in the quiet, reverent tones of men who had just seen a line drawn in the sand. Patton's soldiers, the infantrymen huddled in freezing foxholes, and the medics working with bare, shaking hands, heard about it. They heard about the German general in the silk robe, the cognac, the stolen masterpieces, and they heard about the man who had walked in and stripped him of his comfort and his pride. For the men on the line, the story was a revelation. Too often, the war felt like a grind of indifferent machinery, where the sacrifice of a private was just a footnote in a general's strategy. But this was different. Patton had not just ordered a supply run. He had made it personal. He had effectively told every soldier in his command that their lives, their pain, and their survival were worth more than the entire legacy of European art. In the medical tents, the impact was immediate. Morale, that fragile, intangible resource that often determined the outcome of battles, surged. When a nurse opened a crate delivered by the repurposed convoy and found it filled with the very supplies they had been denied for days, she didn't just see medical gear. She saw a commander who had fought for them. The story bridged the gap between the brass and the boots. It redefined what it meant to serve under Patton. It wasn't just about the pursuit of victory anymore. It was about a shared code. The arrogance of the enemy had been confronted by the unwavering demand for justice, and for once, the men in the mud felt that the man at the top was looking out for them, not just at them. The German general had tried to use the war to enrich his own life. Patton had used the war to save the lives of his soldiers. And in that, the moral victory was total. The soldiers of the Third Army moved forward with a renewed sense of purpose, carrying the heavy knowledge that their commander, flawed and fire-breathing as he was, would tear the world apart to ensure they had what they needed to survive. The administrative wheels of the Third Army turned with a speed that von Klessen found terrifying. He had spent his entire career shielded by the privileges of high command, believing that in the hierarchy of war there were lines that even an enemy could not cross. He was wrong. In Patton's sector, the only currency was competence and character. By the time the paperwork for his transfer to the prisoner of war camps was finalized, von Klessen was a ghost. He was no longer a general. He was a liability, a stain on the very military code he claimed to uphold. The looted art, once his secret pride and his escape plan, was now treated as nothing more than evidence in a crime scene. It was catalogued, photographed, and crated under the watchful eye of Allied military police, destined for a secure repository far from the front lines until it could be returned to the museums and families he had sought to plunder. The culture he claimed to be saving had been stripped of its stolen status and restored to its proper place, not in the dark rooms of a Bavarian chateau, but back into the light of the public trust. Patton didn't stick around to watch the final processing. He had an army to move. The war was in its final, frantic gasps, and the push toward the heart of the Reich left no room for lingering over the fate of a disgraced German officer. Yet, the story stuck. It became a cautionary tale that circulated in the hushed, fearful whispers of the German High Command, the story of the art thief general who had been brought down not by a bomb or a bullet, but by the cold, unyielding scrutiny of a man who valued his soldiers more than all the gold in Europe. For the GIs who had manned the trucks and the nurses who had filled the crates with life-saving medicine, the chateau raid was a profound validation. It wasn't just about the paintings, it was about the precedent. It proved that even in the brutal, chaotic reality of global conflict, there were lines of decency that could not be crossed without swift and decisive consequence. As Patton's convoy pulled away, leaving the chateau in the rearview mirror, he didn't check his watch or consult the map for the next strategic objective. He looked ahead at the trucks in front of him, trailing dust and exhaust into the distance. They were full of plasma, morphine, and bandages. For George S. Patton, the mission was simple. The soldiers had been served justice, and the medicine was on its way. That was enough. The convoy, repurposed from the German general's vanity project, reached the 12th Evacuation Hospital by late afternoon. The dust of the Bavarian roads was still settling on the trucks as they pulled into the muddy lot. There were no trumpets, no fanfare. Just the grind of diesel engines and the urgent, precise shouts of medical personnel rushing to unload. When the back of the first truck was opened, the nurses and orderlies stopped in their tracks. They had been expecting empty promises, or, at best, a trickle of outdated supplies. Instead, they saw crates stamped with medical markings that had been buried in the logistics backlog for months. It was a treasure far greater than the paintings von Klessen had tried to hoard. Plasma, sulfa drugs, clean gauze, morphine. It was the absolute unvarnished lifeblood of the front line. One head surgeon, a man whose hands hadn't stopped shaking for 48 hours, climbed into the back of the truck. He picked up a box, checked the label, and let out a sound, half laugh, half sob, that cut through the sterile tension of the hospital grounds. He looked at the driver, a soldier with the same grime-streaked face as every other man in the Third Army, and simply nodded. The change in the hospital was immediate. The frantic, desperate rationing of anesthesia ceased. The men who had been lying in the dark, white-knuckled and biting through leather straps to suppress the agony of their wounds, were finally given the relief they had been denied. The doctors could operate with steady hands, knowing they had the tools to keep their patients alive through the night. In the eyes of those surgeons and nurses, the act of justice Patton had committed at the chateau wasn't a bureaucratic maneuver. It was a moral imperative. Patton had looked at the balance sheet of the war and realized that a piece of canvas, no matter how exquisite, was worthless compared to the living, breathing men who were paying the price for his march. The story traveled down the chain of command, not as a lecture on logistics, but as a testament to command intent. Patton hadn't just secured supplies. He had sent a message that reached every foxhole from Bavaria to the Rhine. He had shown them that while they were out there risking their lives, the hierarchy of values was not just a suggestion, it was law. The soldiers of the Third Army were more than pawns in a general's game. They were the priority, and their lives were the only currency that truly mattered to their leader. As the sun set, the hospital wards hummed with a quiet, efficient rhythm, a stark contrast to the hollow silence of the looted chateau just miles away. The dust of the Bavarian roads hung in the air long after the last truck had disappeared toward the front. Patton remained on the perimeter of the chateau, the stillness of the morning broken only by the distant, rhythmic thunder of artillery. A reminder that the war and its relentless demand for sacrifice did not pause for morality plays. He watched the 4 trucks, once symbols of an officer's greed, now carrying the weight of salvation for men whose names he would never know. There was no grand ceremony for what had transpired in the night. No medals would be struck, no official commendations read. It was just a correction of the ledger. A thief had been caught, the stolen lifeblood of the army had been recovered, and the order of things had been restored. For Patton, this was the essence of the commander's burden. It wasn't just about the maps or the grand strategy. It was about the integrity of the men beneath him. If he allowed the system to become corrupted by the vanity of the few, he was failing the many who bled in the fields. He had treated von Klessen not with the decorum of an equal, but with the cold, hard judgment required to maintain the sanctity of his army. As the sun rose higher, painting the scarred German landscape in shades of gold, Patton climbed back into his jeep. The war would continue. There were still cities to take and bridges to cross. But as he turned the vehicle toward the front, he carried the quiet satisfaction of a man who had defended the dead and the broken. The German general would fade into the statistics of the prisoner camps, a footnote in a collapsing empire. But the medicine would save lives, the order would hold. And the men who heard the story of the chateau would keep fighting, knowing that their commander measured the true value of war not in gold or canvas, but in the survival of his soldiers. The moral payoff was not in the glory of the act, but in the knowledge that for one night, the machinery of war had been forced to serve the humanity of those caught in its gears. Patton stared ahead, his jaw set, and drove back into the fray.